Russia has a population of about 140 million. So clearly Ukraine now have less than 30 million. You can see what that means on the ground. European Union has 300 million. Now that means that in a battle of industrial strength plus human capital, which is what both world wars were, it's what the Ukraine wars turned into, the Europeans can outgun the Russians because there are twice as many of them.
Let's come on to Donald Trump. Were he to return to the White House next month, what do you think it would mean for NATO? Some people suggest he could even go as far as withdrawing from the alliance one day. He certainly had threatened or made noises in his first term that implied that, although he was stopped by a lot of his advisors. And some people say that was a bluff because he wanted European countries in NATO to increase their defence spending, and there's a decent case to be made for that. But what do you think his approach to NATO would be?
Well, so I think the first thing about Donald Trump is that he's very unpredictable. That's the kind of, and it's essentially a feature, not a bug. So the Americans who have, particularly sort of former senior US officials, have sympathy with Trump, or even those who don't, he will be unpredictable. And when the facts change, he changes his mind. And when the facts don't change, he also sometimes changes his mind. So, John Bolton, who was his national security advisor, has been saying for years that he thinks Trump would quit NATO at some point because he thinks that Trump is a sort of showman and that is the sort of thing that he will do at some point. So he's the man who does it. It'll be challenging. The last Pentagon budget had an amendment attached to it by Tim Kaine, Senator for Virginia, Marco Rubio, Senator for Florida. So bipartisan amendment. That means that quitting NATO has to be agreed by both Congress and the Senate. That's quite hard. They're very popular in both. I think there are several questions that a new Trump administration, or indeed a Harris administration, will have to answer. The first is what you do about Ukraine. And again, that will shape everything. And that could go in a variety of different ways, frankly. There's obviously talk about doing a peace deal. If there is a peace deal, does that include security guarantees for Ukraine? Does that involve bringing Ukraine into NATO? With Trump, I think nothing's unpredictable. So, yes, he might leave NATO. He might expand NATO to include Ukraine. They're both plausible outcomes. And there are people, Mike Pompeo, he'll be a Secretary of State again, very likely, very pro-Ukraine, believes that only by defending Ukraine can you defend Taiwan. Elbridge Colby, who may well be his national security advisor, completely different approach, believes that actually the US should be ready to abandon both Ukraine and Taiwan if they need to, so that it can look after its own security interests and hold China in particular back sort of in the bigger picture. And also it's a fair assumption that anyone who is working with Trump, although Mike Pompeo has handled this relatively well, tends to get upset with him, and Trump throws his toys out the pram and fires them at some point. So whoever Trump starts out with, he's very unlikely to finish with. A lot would depend on how well Rutte does it. I think one of the reasons they didn't go with Ursula von der Leyen is that she would definitely have played badly with Trump. They have a pre-existing bad relationship, and that would have meant that things would have got off to a bad start and probably got worse. I think those first kind of meetings between Rutte and Trump are going to be quite important if it happens. But also, we don't know much about a Harris administration. We don't know who her top picks are going to be. We don't know what approach they're going to take. Most of the people she's hired have been in Biden's National Security Council or advising her. But they have quite different approaches. We could even see a second term of Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor. So all of those things are kind of in the wind. And then again, you have what actually happens in the real world. Do the Ukrainians are running out of people? What the Ukrainians would like is ideally European troops on their soil doing training, but also acting as a blocking position north of Kyiv. They thought they were going to get it earlier this year. Macron was up for it. Then Macron got emasculated in his elections, and that plan's been dropped. So, there's lots and lots of moving parts, and we could see a major war in the Middle East sometime between now and, whenever this podcast comes out. So, there's a lot of stuff going on. Worth pointing out, last point on the Middle East, there are two US aircraft carriers in the Middle East. That's the bulk of US naval strike forces. That means they're not in Europe, it means they're not in Asia. So again, events can really change things. And most Secretary Generals have ended up facing a world they didn't quite expect to.
There's been a lot of talk this year about NATO trying to Trump-proof itself, or indeed Ukraine's allies trying to Trump-proof support for Ukraine. To what extent do you think that will be successful if indeed Trump does win again?
I mean, the first point is that the Europeans, and I would include the Brits in this, have not really got their defence industrial base together. The North Koreans are giving Russia about 3 million artillery shells a year. The combined industry of the US plus Europe cannot meet that. And it doesn't look like it's going to be able to meet it anytime particularly soon. The US are stepping up their drone production, so is Europe. But again, the US have slightly deeper pockets, but no one has very much. So I think there are problems that go beyond Trump. The Ramstein process, which is now NATO has more of a dog in. It's not quite clear how it's going to work, but that's the process by which Ukraine gets weapons, is quite important, but actually most things get agreed bilaterally anyway. The Trump administration gave Javelin, the anti-tank rockets, to Ukraine. A new Trump administration may well do the same thing. But the bigger picture is, and again, this is not really about Trump. It's about making sure that Europe is able to defend itself, because the Americans will have only limited clout, because they will also be in the Far East. If you look at what the Germans have done, the Canadians have done, both of which take a lot of flack for not spending 2.5% of GDP. They're both moving a brigade permanently into the Baltics, or at least permanently for the next few years, building base infrastructure there. That just means there's a lot of European and Canadian troops and American troops in Poland who you need to run over to invade the continent, and that's the kind of big tripwire. And I think Europe will be spending a lot more on defence than when Trump came in 2016, and he may well take that as a win.
I mean, I suppose it also raised the question, well, how much more should we be spending on defence? You've got the Conservative Party leadership contest happening in the UK now, several candidates pledging we need to go to 3% of GDP in terms of defence spending. Is that even enough?
I mean, I think we could burn 3% of GDP on nothing useful tomorrow. We're about the seventh largest spender on defence in terms of globally, and we just sent one of our 6 or 7 attack submarines. The first one went to sea for 108 something days. So a lot of our kit, we spend a huge amount of money. We don't get that much out of it. If you look at someone like Finland, who spends a lot less than us, I mean, a huge amount less than us, but they have a reserves that are about 150,000 strong. It's substantially bigger than the British Army. And essentially they do that by training up a lot of Finns to fight, and they wouldn't have the money to pay all of them in time of war unless they would get budgetary support from the European Union. So they couldn't actually employ those people full time, except in time of war. But in time of war, obviously they would, because it would be an existential battle. So I think, to be candid, the Finns are probably the upper edge for bang per buck in terms of what they get. The Poles are spending a lot, about 4% GDP, heavily on kit. That's probably a good shout. But again, there are questions about when that gets delivered. Is their industry up to it? I think it's more about what you do with it than how much you spend, to be candid. We spend a lot of money on things that don't work particularly well. There are certain things we have to spend a lot of money on. If Trump was to leave NATO, the British and French strategic nuclear deterrent goes from being a bit of a weird thing that the two countries have that doesn't really change the price of fish to the existential nuclear defense of Europe. And the French take that very seriously. And I think we would take it seriously in the event of Trump leaving NATO. And that means we don't have a lot of choice, but to actually build that's a huge amount of stuff. I think the biggest question, and I've alluded to it, is how fast can you scale? So to deter Russia, the first question is, can you give them a bloody nose when they come across the front? So the answer to that is yes, definitely with the Americans. It's a bit more challenging without, because particularly a lot of the air power that the Americans bring to Europe would potentially vanish. Your second question, and Ukraine has shown this, is can you still be in the fight in 3 to 5 years' time of a really long war? So Russia has a population of about 140 million. So clearly Ukraine now have less than 30 million. You can see what that means on the ground. European Union has 300 million. Now that means that in a battle of industrial strength plus human capital, which is what both world wars were, it's what the Ukraine wars turned into, the Europeans can outgun the Russians because there are twice as many of them. How does Britain play into that? Do we want to be in a situation where we can scale? I would say Britain has one existential threat that doesn't particularly relate to NATO would be gone in this scenario. We don't face an existential threat unless Germany and France get taken over by pro-Putin far-rightists. And if they did, and that's not an unthinkable prospect in the next 10, 15 years, then there's an authoritarian bloc that extends from the Korean Peninsula to the Straits of Dover. Now, under those circumstances, you probably want to have a much larger army and probably less kit, but more weaponry, if you see what I mean. Aircraft carriers not terribly useful in that kind of scenario. Lots and lots of infantry, yes. So, if you look at what a lot of countries are looking at how you scale, that's not the way the British Army has ever really thought. And I don't think it's not a partisan issue here, I don't think. You saw with Rishi Sunak suggesting conscription, it wasn't done in a very mature way. The world would have to get a lot worse over the next 3 to 5 years before Britain started thinking that kind of unthinkable. But if things did go that way, so for example, if we saw, an escalation into what we saw in Ukraine and the Baltic states, a long-running war there, then I think we would have to think very differently about defence. But that also means the Americans think about this a lot. It takes a very long time to build a ship. It takes quite a long time to build a tank. It takes quite a long time to train a sort of very experienced soldier. Your ability to restock has to be faster than that. So the Ukrainians were training soldiers, getting them on the ground in 72 hours during the invasion of Kiev, sometimes a bit less. Drones can be built faster than fast jets. So your industrial base has to not quite look like an old-fashioned industrial base, but you have to still be in the fight in year 2, month 3, year 3. And if you do that, you'll never have to fight the war because they won't come. And that's the question that lots of places face, and everyone faces it slightly differently. And I think the Strategic Defence Review here will have to engage with that. And it's going to be interesting to see what answers they come up with.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.